Hello, colleagues, and welcome to another episode of DINCast, where this time I'm going to be exploring the world of data and all things to do with data, which I know is a really important subject to a lot of you guys out there. And I'm delighted to welcome along Tony Fish, who's best described as a pioneer, a maverick, and a polymath. Good morning, Tony.
Good morning, Ian. How are you this morning?
I'm very well, sir. I'm hoping to be enlightened after our discussion around data, which is a hugely important issue to those working in the social housing space. But before we get into that, it'd be great to find out a bit more about you, your journey, and how we've found you today.
The interesting piece is always that I'm severely dyslexic, slightly autistic, and somewhere on the Asperger's scale. So me, school, education never worked. Therefore, I've built up 5 businesses of my own, sold them, and been involved in a couple of venture funds, one as the general partner. Made about 100 investments. Sold last business just about 2 years ago, and went off on sabbatical and wanted to reflect on what to do next, because I'm now the wrong side of 50, and that's always a bit of a cause for self-reflection. And I went away with a question for myself, which is what I see on boards as a continual problem is, how do we make better decisions? How do we make better decisions with data? And the last part of it is, how do we make better decisions with data and be better ancestors? Which I've sort of been playing around with now for 2 years or so, which we're going to go explore, I think, on here.
Yes, absolutely. It's a fascinating sort of area to look at. So come back to your first point about, your reflective time over the last year. Where do you think, when perhaps not getting it as right as we could do around making better decisions? Because the last year has been, we've been bombarded with data and statistics, and not all of the decisions we've made have been the correct ones. So where are we going wrong?
Yeah, it's not so much we make bad decisions. Decision making has always been there. The specific question I was interested in is, can we make better decisions with data? Which is kind of like, a question we all of us self-reflect on, because everyone's told that data is dead important. And I sit there going, look, first of all, data is not oil, it's not labour, it's not sunshine, it's not any of those analogies. Data is data. It has a unique bunch of characteristics. And most companies, when they look at data, they sort of go, oh, well, it's a bit of finance data, or a bit of customer data, a bit of this. And actually, if you take the entirety of data in an organisation, finance will make up 3%. Yet 80+% of our decisions are judged on that 3% of data. So that just suggests, in any logical process, there's a gap between what we decide and what we could be deciding. And I'm really interested, can we close that gap? And what does that gap look like? And how do we go through it? You're going to ask.
Well, I was going to say, yeah. I mean, how do we do that? Because if a lot of decisions, and I know your latest sort of blog covers this point about sort of the finance, does some data have more weighting than others? And is that 3% of the data within finance actually the really important, crucial elements?
So that all depends on the framing that you give your decision. So if your decision is effectively a shareholder primacy, I need to deliver back to my shareholders a decision, therefore I need a certain balance sheet, profit and loss, and I need an incentive scheme, which means I get paid. Hey, 100%. Okay, the only data that matters is finance. You're in social housing. Finance is not the predominant driver. Yes, you've got to be sustainable. Yes, you've got to deliver shareholder, but you also have a enormous number of other criteria which need to be fulfilled. And the question is, can you and are you fulfilling those criteria? In the big world, and I say the big world, the Larry Finks of this world, where he sits there going with BlackRock, in his last letters over the last 3 years has gone ESG as environmental, social and governance. So everybody's upgrading from pure shareholder primacy and deliver to, we've actually got to make better decisions for sustainability. And we're all struggling. What the hell does that actually mean? And what is the right data set we need to collect to be able to make those decisions? And this last piece, which is, when we've collected some data and we've made a decision, how do we know the impact of what we've done is actually beneficial? And this is where it all gets sort of in the weeds, effectively.
Well, I mean, the purpose of this is to steal us through those weeds, Tony. So again, I mean, ESG is becoming a bigger prevalence within the social housing space now. So, from your perspective, what are the kind of things? What is the kind of data that leaders should now be collecting and paying attention to?
Yeah, there's an interesting one, and I'll use an analogy, which is that at some point in our past, and this is a human past, that we had hierarchies about power and control and hierarchies about decision making, which were fairly much aligned. And it wasn't that the power and control at the top got involved in the weeds. What the power and control did at the top is think intergenerationally. How do I make sure there's sustainability of my business in a stupidly long term? Whereas the people at the lower echelons of the business, in that sort of hierarchy, knew exactly what they had to do on a daily basis to respond to what was ever happening. What we've done is taken almost a layered vertical way of dealing with businesses and make decisions. And what data's done is taken it from this direction as horizontal to vertical. So all data at the bottom reaches the board at the top. And we see this in the news, where the politician is asked why an individual has been treated like this, and the politician has to make a case, and the politician always comes back and says, we won't make a view on a particular case. And it's that decision layering filtering, because what the politician should be doing is thinking, in 50 years time, have we got the right prison system? In 50 years time, have we got the right policing system? In 50 years time, have we got the right economy? They shouldn't be worrying today if something has happened. Yet we want everybody to know everything and make decisions at minutiae about everything and hold everybody accountable. So suddenly we have data has created a problem for us, which means we can't see the wood for the trees. So we're getting way too involved in detail without looking for the signals. And social housing is, some people need to worry about social housing today and if people are in the right place. Then we need people tomorrow. Have we got the right heating systems for the next 5 years? Then we need another set of people. Will we have enough housing in 30 years' time? Then we need another bunch of people who are going, what type of housing will we need in 50 years? And there are different gaps, and you need people to work out which bits of data you need to work out which gaps. But the problem is the need today becomes so loud, we don't allow the people at the top to make decisions for 50 years. They have to make decisions today. And therefore, we end up with boards effectively running organisations which make decisions by a moment, which is just completely nuts.
And does that sort of lead us on to actually that the current business models are broken or need some massive sort of fixing? Because I mean, what you've highlighted there is this whole long-term versus short-term thinking, and yet people are rewarded, they're measured on sort of whether you've met those KPIs over the last year or so, and yet you're talking about, particularly your piece about, are we going to be good ancestors? Looking backwards in 50 years' time, most people are just trying to get through to the end of the day.
Yeah. And part of it's, the flood of data means that the day has become more important than thinking about the future, or it's become more difficult to think about the future. We've forgotten. I'm not sure if the business models are the question. What we've forgotten is how to make long-term decisions. Now that's partly driven because the shareholder primacy model has demanded shorter and shorter and shorter returns and more out of the system, so it drives efficiency and effectiveness. And that means that you're better off making a 1% improvement today than worrying about a 10% improvement over time, because your reward is coupled to 1% today, not a hope of 10% in the future. And therefore we have this direct coupling between incentives and short-termism. But there's a bigger global problem, which is where Bill Gates and everybody else speaks to, which is the business model piece, which says we've basically taken our little blue planet, we've dug up, cut down, moved, wasted and built. That has basically been our economy for the last 50,000 years. In the next 50,000 years, we've got to reuse, renovate, shared risk, and then do a small amount of digging up, cutting down and moving. That is a fundamental shift, which is where the Larry Finks and Bill Gates, everybody else, and Elon Musk are focused. That yes, there's a fundamental change in the real models, but that's going to happen over a much longer period of time.
And so, do you think leaders' relationship with data, and particularly data quality, is going to have to change? Are we going to have to invest in different skills, different ways of analysing data, different lenses to sort of look at data to make probably quite different decisions?
Yeah, the simple answer is yes, and then we explain the yes. If we go back, 30, 40 years, virtually the only person at the board who understood finance was the CFO. The only person who understood marketing at the board was the head of marketing. The only person who understood sales was chief sales or revenue. The only person who understood the technology was the CTO, CIO, if there was one 50 years ago, and quite often there wasn't. And the person who understood operations. And then over the last 50 years, what we tried to create is a much more diverse board where numbers of people have diversity of skills. And everybody went on the finance training for a non-financial director, and everyone got trained up in finance. And you're spot on, which is we forgot data. So we're all arriving at the board, and we've kind of got the marketing skills, the ops skills, we've got the economic skills, all of these skills. We don't get data, and because we fundamentally don't understand data, we don't understand it. We're completely blind to it. And data it's a new philosophy. It literally is like suddenly discovering finance and you'd never had it. It's like discovering marketing and you never understood marketing. You're suddenly discovering, oh, what is marginal cost? What's the difference between margin and markup? And it's like the scales fall off because you've kind of like seen it. To get data in the same way, it needs a huge amount of training because it is an entire philosophy. And yeah, some people believe, I only need, the classics of marketing's dead easy. I only need to do it. And it's like, no, you misjudge the complexity of marketing. And most people want to misjudge the complexity of data. They want to just think it's a bit of stats and it's a bit of a data lake and it's a bit that, and that is where they've completely fooled themselves to the levels of problems and complexities and biases, misunderstanding, misrepresentations. And way too many boards I see have data, papers coming to them with data, yet they cannot understand the rights or the attestation of the data in that paper. And because they can't test the knowledge of knowledge and where the knowledge comes from in that data, and they can't test the provenance and lineage of the data, they're making a decision. It's a bit like, your kid walking through the front door having just watched a TV program and telling you to go and buy this new car because they saw it on TV, and you go, yeah, I'll go and do it. And it's exactly the same. The kid has one piece of information. Suddenly it's the most important piece of information, so we make a decision on it. It's utter madness.
So you mentioned the word then. I just wondered whether this is because we've had poor experiences of this around trust. And do we actually trust, as I say, the provenance and where that data is coming from? And again, I suppose this comes back to how much do organizations want to invest in getting good quality data? So obviously you work across many, many sectors, working with some fantastic businesses around this. So I just wondered, are there some good examples out there of organizations who are really disrupting and building sound businesses based around really, really good quality data?
So the oddity is, if you go and look at the best businesses perceived in the world, who are perceived to be data orientated businesses, all of them will tell you they're 1% in the data world. They won't claim to be more than 1%, and actually even saying they're 1%, they're a bit skeptical. So don't believe because somebody else is further along your path that they actually know any better than what they're doing than you do. But yes, they're trying to make it. The interesting thing for me is things like Section 172 of the Companies Act, which most people have never read, never bothered going to. And in there is a pile of fiduciary duties on behalf of the directors. And it's about justification, particularly about how you actually justify decisions. And increasingly, directors are going to be held accountable for decisions they make, particularly when it comes to data. And unless they can prove they understand both the data and things like the rights, the attestation, they're going to get into trouble. But it takes us into another world, which is where you really get into the weeds. And it's one of those horrible words, and it's about the structure of data, and it's called ontology. And the trouble with ontology and structures of data, which we don't like, is the way your data is structured means that you can only see the answers that structure gives you. So if you pick the wrong structure, you are going to be making the wrong decisions, because you can't make another decision because the data does not give you that choice. The next level of complexity of this is that we're all in supply chains, we're all in ecosystems, the trend of today. And somebody else shares data with you, which you suck into your piece and you share it on. But that person has a different ontology, you have an ontology, and the person up has a different ontology. And you can't share different structured ontologies and expect the data to give you an answer. What happens is you create patterns which don't actually exist in life. And this is where I spend most of my time with boards, is that you have no idea if the data being presented to you is completely made up, an answer based on actually things that don't exist because of a problem in the structure of data. And they have no mechanism to ask those questions. But if you were a finance, you know how to ask the questions because we've been through the training. So yes, we've got to upskill very, very fast.
And is there a sort of, are we sort of looking at this because as boards or as leaders, we're looking for simple answers in a really, really sort of complex world? Is that part of the challenge? Oh, right, that answer there, actually, yeah, that helps me. I can take that decision and I can start to move on.
Yeah, and we've done this in a way, we created our remuneration committees and we create our audit committees and we outsource audit to a company. And any of the readers, forget everything I've said, just go down and search for Bryden's, so Donald Bryden's report on audit done 2019. And the 72 recommendations that he comes up, which is now being forced through for change in the audit committee. And we sit there having outsourced audit to a company and believe that we tick in the box and we've got the audit committee, they're doing everything. You read the 72 recommendations and you go, how the hell did I ever sign off on audit in finance? It's utterly corrupt. And actually, it doesn't tell me, and I'm making decisions on things I cannot actually stand by. And I think that's the scary piece, that we've deluded ourselves, even on the data set we have, which we believe we have our attestation and rights over. Yet we cannot actually stand by the audit of virtually any PLC and virtually any company in the UK or in the world, because we've corrupted it so far.
So is there a conclusion around that actually most businesses are in business out of luck than out of good management?
There's the fundamental point of the audit problem is that if you go back 20 years and you downloaded a set of accounts for a bank, you could download the year before this year and you could do a side-by-side comparison and see the delta between what was going on. Not only that, 20 years ago you could download a set of accounts for a bank and the banking industry, and you could do side-by-side comparisons for all of the banks in an industry. As of today, with the way audit's gone, is if you download a set of accounts from one company over a 2-year period, it's pointless comparing them. So forget trying to do an industry-based analysis. It's a complete waste of time.
And I suppose what a lot of leaders will look to for data is to help them get that forward look in terms of sort of forecasting, and yet data is always going to be a backward look. So is there any value in using the current data to sort of make some of these forecasts and projections for future business strategies?
So you run into a typical problem about the way data is perceived. Okay. Yes, data is collected and it is on activities that have happened. You've now got two categories, which is one is statistics and one is data science, and they're completely different. And the analogy I often use is one of clouds. So what we do is we can collect the data and we know that the cloud is in the sky. And we collect all of these data samples. And what I can do is I can do a statistical analysis to say on what type of weather right now a cloud will occur. Okay, and I can do a data analysis on exactly the same. And actually I can end up with some really interesting differences between the way statistics work and data science works. But what data science will try and do is, rather than do the sample of me being here looking at the cloud, what data science will do is collect the ecosystem of data. So where was, or what was the weather 100 miles away? Where am I now, and what will happen in 100 miles? And what data science starts to do is start to predict actually where do the boundaries occur that change occurs, such that I can predict where a cloud will occur. What statistics can only ever tell you is if a cloud is likely to be there because of what's happened. So you end up with a modelling technique, and this is more often referred to as digital twins. So the modelling techniques we now have in data science, okay, is completely different statistics, which is the prediction piece was pretty rubbish, where actually I'm now modelling ecosystems and behaviours. And because I'm modelling ecosystems and behaviours, it's not a forecast, it is a behaviour. And it's completely different to the ideologies. And that's where it's, you know, I always say I pee around in the weeds, and what I'm trying to do is connect not the weeds, but the ecosystems between the weeds. So why does that weed suddenly look really interesting? It's not because actually it's thriving because of the many things around it. And we have to be in the weeds to understand these things.
So coming back to one of your sort of earlier points about data is not the new oil, not new sunshine, etc. A lot of people do, I see that phrase used an awful lot. Is it possible then, to take in some of the techniques that you've talked about, to actually turn data into something the equivalent of oil, i.e. it's got a significant value or not?
Yeah, I've just written a piece which I published actually yesterday, which is one of the worst things we can do is put data as an asset on a balance sheet. And the reason is, for me, it's a political thing about control. So more often than not in a company, there's an axis of dominance of control, and that axis falls to the CEO and CFO. The CFO fundamentally knows that better decisions can be made using data than they can with finance. And if you're a political player and you quickly wake up and go, right, as a finance player, if I want to continue to be the dominant voice and controller of all decisions, I need to get hold of data. The quickest way I can get control of data is to put it onto the balance sheet and say it's an asset or liability. As soon as a company does that, they are giving further control to the CFO, which now if you look at it, we've taken HR and we've put teams onto the balance sheet. We've put branding onto the balance sheet with marketing. Everything goes to finance, which ultimately becomes a controller of what's actually being said by the organisation. So the axis remains CEO, CFO. What becomes really interesting with data is that axis gets broken. So you're ending up with these huge political battles in organisations as the CFO is fighting for survival of control, of being the most important decision maker, where actually the CDO and the person coming from data is likely to be, over the next 3 to 5 years, the most important decision maker. And it suggests why every CEO is probably going to come via a CDO route in the next 5 to 7 years. And those people who don't understand data are really going to find it tremendously difficult in a data-orientated world to find those roles which are going to be able to be fulfilling. So yeah, we're seeing I think we're seeing a political change inside, or the politics inside organisations fighting out this very problem. And I know you're going to ask a question. It's so many boards don't want to have this conversation because they haven't got the skills sat around the board. Politically, there's a number of players who are preventing this conversation from happening because they know if it does, they're going to lose power.
Yeah, it's a fascinating balance between whether data democratizes across the business, or as you're putting forward, actually it's going to be consolidated into an even smaller part of the business. So does data have a shelf life then?
Yeah, the half-life of data has been an ongoing saga for years. And there's the question you've actually got to start with is, what is my ontology? What is the structure of the data and how am I going to view what I'm going to view? And the reason for doing that is once you've set out the ontology, and people really hate my next phraseology, you actually describe a data philosophy. And people say, forget it, Fish, we're not going to do data philosophies. And it's like, yeah, but you already have these unsaid things in an organisation called culture. And culture, realistically, is a people philosophy. So you just want to call it culture rather than people philosophy. I haven't got a better word for calling a data philosophy something, because if I call it ontology, you really hate it. But we've got to call it something. In accounting, we just call it accounting. Actually, it's a philosophy of the way that we do reporting. So, you might not like the words, but we've got to get there in terms of what we call it. And because we've got to get these conversations going, people find it tremendously difficult to have these conversations because they haven't got the word sets and they haven't got the outline about what it actually means to them, and they're kind of like preventing us from having these very open discussions. So what I've also done is this thing called peak paradox, and peak paradox is a methodology to have these discussions at the board without the conflicts of people having political power, so we can have an opinion about where we see the philosophies starting to sit.
Perhaps that's something else we can sort of come back and return to, Tony, because I think it's a fascinating discussion about how we're sort of going to reshape organisations as well. Another question around sort of data, and because obviously as organisations are collecting more and more data, and it's exponentially sort of building up within the businesses. So what is the best way to sort of use that? Does data have an inflationary cost? The more that we're sort of collecting, is it going to slow organisations down rather than speed them up?
Yeah, again, it's super interesting. For me, it's the wrong framing of the question. So if you're in a position of selling hosting or data analytics, those questions companies keep occurring, either to sell a different system or a different analysis tool or some other piece of methodology. If we go back to some of the questions, which is the first one most people really want to try and tackle is, what problem does this solve? And that's a really interesting set of questions. So if I want to reduce my costs, what data do I need to be able to reduce my costs? If I'm going to do new products, what products do I need? If I want to be more efficient and more effective, what do I actually need? So that's one bunch of questions. The second bunch of questions is, what problem will this solve? Or what's the problem to be solved next year? What's the problem to be solved in 3 years? What data do I need to be able to ensure I can solve that problem in 3 years' time? Then the last one, which is, if we're going to make better decisions to be ancestors, okay, what data will I need to know that I've had a positive impact and been a better ancestor? So to me, it's the reflection of the questions we need, not just collecting more data. So way too many people believe that once you've got the data, you can solve the problem. But if you've got the wrong ontology and wrong structure, forget it. Data absolutely can tell you to do completely utterly the wrong things. Boards have always been trained in asking questions, and they are the skills that boards really need now, but they need around them the support that when they're asking the questions, we're able to gather those sets of data.
Well, Tony, it's reached the end of our sort of time here today, but I mean, it's always fascinating to have a conversation. I know we could have easily have gone on, as long again looking at this, and I'd love to return to some of these big questions with you and see what difference we can make sort of within the social housing space. But it's been an absolute pleasure listening to you today and chatting on with you. So thank you very much for your time, sir. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you, Ian. And from my perspective, I think what you do with the social housing is critically important to society. And the one piece of data you do want to see so much more of is, how does social housing affect all of society? Because they're the data sets that actually say why what you're doing is super important, not what problem have I solved. So yeah, I think there's some great things to explore. Thank you for inviting me.